Hey, grade 9, welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into Biology Unit 1, Lesson 1, Introduction to Biology and the Nature of Science. My goal for us today is actually really simple, but absolutely crucial. We are going to build a rock-solid foundation for your entire year in this subject. And we're going to do that by first understanding the actual rules of science, and then taking those rules and applying them directly to the wild, dynamic world of ecosystems. Here's our quick game plan for today. First, the nature of science. Second, the methods of science. Third, organisms and their relationships. Fourth, energy flow in ecosystems. And finally, a quick formative check and recap. Let's get right to it. Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1, the nature of science. Let's start by busting a huge myth right out of the gate. A lot of people think that scientific knowledge follows this strict graduation path, right? Like a hypothesis gathers enough evidence, levels up to become a theory, and then if it just works hard enough, it finally graduates into a law. No way. That is entirely false. One simply does not graduate into the other because they're totally different types of knowledge. In reality, laws are just generalizations or patterns we see in nature. Theories, on the other hand, are the actual explanations of those generalizations. And this quote right here brilliantly illustrates how laws work in the real world. It's from astronaut Bill Anders during the Apollo 8 mission. When someone asked him who was flying the spacecraft, he replied that Isaac Newton was doing most of the driving. Why would he say that? Because scientific laws, like the law of gravity, are such incredibly precise mathematical patterns in nature that we can literally rely on them to steer a spacecraft safely through the absolute void of space. We don't actually need a theory explaining why gravity works to confidently use the law of how it behaves. Moving right along to Section 2, the methods of science. So, how do biologists actually generate these ideas? Well, everything starts with a hypothesis, but notice the specific phrasing we're using: a suggested, testable, and falsifiable explanation. I want to heavily emphasize that word, falsifiable. True science absolutely must be open to being proven untrue. If a claim can't be tested in a way that could potentially prove it wrong, like say claims about the supernatural, it simply isn't science. Being open to modification is the absolute hallmark of scientific knowledge. So how do we actually test these falsifiable hypotheses? You've definitely seen this traditional list of steps before: observation, question, hypothesis, experiment. And while that lays out the classic method, I really want to stress right now that this is a flexible tool for creativity. It is not some rigid, universal rulebook posted on the wall of every single lab. Science just doesn't always operate in a straight, linear line. Sometimes an experiment brings up an entirely new question, and scientists have to jump back and forth. So the crucial point is that underlying all these flexible steps is logical thinking. First, we've got inductive reasoning. This is where you make a bunch of specific observations and build up to a broad, general conclusion. Then you have deductive reasoning, which is basically the exact opposite. You start with a general principle or law, and you use it to predict specific expected results. And in reality, scientists use both of these methods constantly in a continuous, dynamic dialogue. Let's anchor these abstract methods into a highly relatable, everyday scenario. Imagine a warm classroom. Your observation? The room is just too warm. This leads to a question, and then your hypothesis. The AC is off. You make a prediction. If I turn it on, the room's going to cool down. Then you run your experiment. You go check the switch. Now, to make it a fair test, you have to have controls, meaning you don't change the lighting or open the windows at the exact same time. If you check and the switch is already on, well, your experimental data just disproves your hypothesis, and you have to come up with a new one. That's literally the scientific method in action. All right, shifting gears to Section 3, organisms and their relationships. We're officially taking the scientific tools we just learned out of the lab and into the wild, starting with this foundational term, ecosystem. An ecosystem includes all the living things, the biotic factors, interacting with each other, and with their abiotic or non-living environment, things like sunlight, water, and soil. But make no mistake here, life in any ecosystem is rarely just peaceful cooperation. It is very often a fierce, high-stakes competition for incredibly limited resources. And that fierce competition brings us to a major ecological rule, the competitive exclusion principle. This principle basically states that two different species absolutely cannot occupy the exact same niche, meaning they can't rely on the exact same resources in the exact same way at the same time. If two species fight for the exact same limited stuff, evolutionary traits will either be selected to reduce that overlap, or, inevitably, one species is going to outcompete the other and drive it to local extinction. Now, what's really interesting about this principle is how clearly we can see it in a classic test tube experiment. Scientists took two single-celled protozoan species, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium codinum. When grown entirely alone in the lab, they both do great, they thrive. But when you put them together in the same test tube, competing for the exact same food source, they just cannot coexist. Paramecium aurelia completely outcompetes Paramecium codinum, driving it to extinction within that tiny habitat. Next up, Section 4, Energy Flow in Ecosystems. So what fuels all this fierce competition and interaction? Energy. And to track this energy, biologists use a concept called a trophic level. This vocabulary word simply describes an organism's specific position within a food chain, and the flow of that energy is strictly linear. It always starts at the bottom with primary producers, like photosynthetic plants and algae that capture solar energy. The herbivores that eat those plants, those are primary consumers. Carnivores that eat the herbivores are secondary consumers, and so on, passing energy sequentially straight up to the apex predators. But here is the critical catch about how that energy flows, and we can use ecologist Howard T. Odom's famous data from the Silver Springs ecosystem as a perfect example. Notice the massive drop in numbers as we go up. The primary producers generate over 20,000 kilocalories per square meter per year, but the primary consumers, they only get about 3,300 of that. By the time we hit the secondary consumers, we're down to just 383. At every single step of a food chain, a massive amount of energy is lost to the environment, mostly as heat, all thanks to the laws of thermodynamics. Which brings us to this dramatic number right here, 21. By the time we reach the tertiary consumers, the absolute top predators in Odom's data, only 21 kilocalories remain available to them from that original 20,000. This beautifully cements exactly why food chains rarely support more than 4 or 5 trophic levels. There simply isn't enough energy left in the system to sustain viable populations any higher up than that. Almost done! Section 5, Formative Check and Recap. Okay, time to quickly test your understanding. Here's a scenario. If a dense, thick cloud blocked all the sunlight to an ecosystem, which trophic level would immediately stop generating new energy and basically impact the rest of the chain? Take a quick mental beat to think about it. Got it? The answer is the primary producers. Because they rely completely on photosynthesis, blocking the sun instantly cuts off the energy fuel source for the entire ecosystem. Let's do a fast, energetic recap to lock in today's concepts. First, remember our big myth bust? Theories explain why things happen while laws generalize what happens. Second, true science fundamentally relies on falsifiable hypotheses and uses a flexible set of methods involving both inductive and deductive reasoning. Third, taking it to the wild, the competitive exclusion principle tells us that two species cannot share the exact same niche. And finally, as energy flows linearly through an ecosystem, it severely drops across trophic levels due to heat loss, which strictly limits the length of food chains. Science isn't just a bunch of facts in a textbook. It's an entirely new way of viewing the world. So now that you actually know the rules of the scientific game, how will you observe the ecosystems around you differently? Next time you step outside, I challenge you to look for the competition, spot the primary producers, and most importantly, ask a falsifiable question. Keep observing Grade 9, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.